And today's title is The Dictator's Handbook, from this book, The Dictator's Handbook, Why Bad Behavior is Almost Always Good Politics. And Bruce is one of the co-authors of this book, and he's a political scientist, professor at New York University, and senior fellow at Hoover Institution. And he's an expert on foreign policy and nation building. And he was a part of creating this Selectorate theory, which I'm hoping to talk about today, which I think was originally outlined in the book, The Logic of Political Survival, and is a theory of government with a focus on the political survival strategies. And I think it's a pretty high level concept for us to know here at the Stoa. So how today's going to work, I'm going to have a brief exchange with Bruce. And if you have questions anytime, pop them in the chat and I'll call on you. You can ask your question to Bruce. If you don't want to be on YouTube, just indicate that and I can read your question on your behalf. So that being said, Bruce, welcome to the Stoa.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Looking forward to it.
And I was thinking like a high level, perhaps 101 on Selectorate theory and the book. It'd be good to start with one of the starting premises of the book. And it's the main motivation of politicians to come to power. And there's a quote, to come to power, to stay in power, and to the extent that they can, to keep control over money. So perhaps that might be a good starting point to discuss the book and the theory.
Yeah, so I mean that's the foundation of the theory. The theory then goes on to say that all organizations, and therefore all governments, but this applies to all organizations, can be divided into at least two groups of people, what we call the Selectorate. Those who have a say, may just be a nominal say, in choosing leaders, and the winning coalition, the subset of the Selectorate whose support is essential to keep a leader in power. So, for example, if we were living in North Korea, the Selectorate might be all of the citizens of North Korea. They have universal adult suffrage. But the winning coalition is just a very tiny number of people, a few generals, the bureaucrats who run Bureau 35 that controls the flow of money, and maybe Kim Jong-un's sister, maybe a couple of other relatives. If we were in China, the winning coalition might be as small as 7 people. In a political system that's more democratic, it might vary between maybe 20%, 15% of the population or of the Selectorate, up to as much as 50% plus 1. In the United States, it's about 20%. It turns out that the bigger the coalition you rely on, the more as a leader that you can survive in power by providing effective public policy. And the smaller the coalition that you rely on, the easier it is, the more efficient it is to survive in power through the use of corruption and bribery. And that's a continuum. No leader does all corruption. No leader does all public goods. They all do a mix, but that mix is heavily dependent on how big a group you depend on. And it is also heavily dependent on the ratio of how many you depend on and from how big a pool, how large the Selectorate is, from which those people are drawn. It turns out a vast number of things about politics follow logically from that little setup.
It's there's a tripartite aspect to it. There's like the nominal Selectorate, which are known as interchangeables, the real Selectorate, which is known as influentials, and then the winning coalition, known as the essentials. I'm curious if you could map out those 3 aspects and those groups and how a leader has to be sensitive to them.
Yeah, so the welfare of the people who are interchangeable, the Selectorate, it's also the welfare of the disenfranchised, depends on public goods provision, on the effectiveness of public policy. So since there's more of that when the coalition gets bigger the coalition, the better off the people are, the folks who are not in power. For leaders, the bigger the coalition is, the less discretionary control they have over money. So the worse off they are. So citizens, their welfare is going like that. Leaders, as the coalition gets bigger, leaders, their welfare is going like that. The coalition has a very complex, interesting relationship, their welfare to the size of the coalition. It looks like the Nike swoosh like this. So small coalition to big, how well off is an individual coalition member? When the coalition is very small down here, they get lots of benefits because they're getting tons of corruption opportunities. As the coalition gets bigger, two things are happening. They're having to share the private goods, the corruption opportunities, with more people, so it's worth less to the individual. But in order to stay in power and beat off rivals, the incumbent has to spend more of the revenue to keep the coalition loyal, less left over for the leader. That's why their welfare is going down. And eventually that extra spending, which is going, as the coalition gets bigger, more and more towards public goods, trumps the loss in private goods, and the curve turns up and it keeps going up. There's a really important critical dividing line. This local high point is equaled when the coalition is sufficiently large. So if you're below this cut point, that's the world of coups and revolutions, where you can make coalition members better off by purging or by expanding. Once you pass this point, you can only make coalition members better off by making the coalition bigger. So it turns out that Karl Marx notwithstanding, for Marx, revolutions were going to happen up in here, and the advanced capitalist societies, all of which are very large coalition societies. They're all past that cut point. They're immune from successful revolutions, and they are immune from successful coups. And in fact, we have data on every government since 1789. No government that is past this cut point has ever had a successful coup or revolution.
And you gave a lot of excellent examples in the book. And the new edition that I was reading, Trump was coming up, and you gestured towards him just now. So I was curious if you can filter him in this model in his first run as president and his kind of recent attempt at Trump.
Absolutely. So the version of the book that you showed is the second edition, just came out in April. We rewrote the whole book, but we added a new chapter, and the new chapter that we added is entitled, "Is Democracy Fragile?" Now, the view that the selectorate theory imposes on people in terms of how the world of politics works is a very cynical and often very depressing view. But with regard to is democracy fragile, we were in the nice position of being optimists, because you're past this cut point, democracy is not fragile. You may wiggle around, as we did during the Trump presidency, but the basic push is upward from this point forward. So the voters responded to what they saw as the negative elements of the Trump presidency, and he was defeated. He attempted to overcome defeat by apparently launching an insurrection. And as we saw, it failed. That is, past this cut point, you just can't mobilize enough people to make it succeed. You can make a few people better off when you're past here by pulling back, but not enough to succeed. Too many people have too much at stake to give up democracy. And so again, we saw in the midterm election that those candidates who were most supportive of the Donald Trump perspective were overwhelmingly defeated in the election. The voters intuitively understand they're up in this world. They don't want to be in this bowl where things are really ugly, except for very few people. So I believe Mr. Trump has had his day. We ran an experiment, and the voters concluded that it wasn't a successful experiment and didn't repeat it.
And I've wrote about the culture war in the past, and that's sort of my area of study. And it seems like the culture war left views a totalitarian creep from like a far right leaders like Trump, and then the culture war right views a totalitarian creep on kind of like technocracy, and then the COVID policies and stuff like that. And so I'm curious with the whole COVID moment, and someone like I'm Canadian, and so someone like Trudeau using the Emergency Act and people accusing totalitarianism and tyranny and stuff like that. How would you understand that moment and that situation through this model?
So if we look at the Canadian system, it's essentially the British Westminster system, first past the post. The Canadian winning coalition is a little over 25% in two-party races. It's, if you have a three-party race, it gets smaller in a hurry, but it's larger than the US winning coalition. So when you have what people perceive as a national emergency, you often get bad behavior by incumbent leaders, because the perception of emergency liberates governments to kind of put the normal rules aside and to behave differently, and then that eventually leads to counter pressure. So my favorite example of that is Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill, arguably the greatest political leader of the 20th century. Winston Churchill, the hero of World War II, is removed from office. He's unelected by the people as the war is drawing to a close, because he was promising them more misery. He wanted to save the empire and so forth. And Clement Attlee said, I don't know, it's time to give you people benefits. It's time for national health care, so for big public goods policies. And so Churchill came back later, but he was voted out. People react. Remember, there were no elections in Britain. Elections were suspended in Britain during World War II. Not in the United States, but yes, in Britain. I don't know about in Canada. So this remarkably visionary guy, but not willing to, or having unity government, not facing the electorate. And as soon as he faced the electorate, they removed him. They wanted, not that they were unhappy with the job he did in World War II, but they wanted something different. And that's the key to the lack of fragility, being past that cut point. The will of a large number of people. The winning coalition is very big. The essentials are a big group. You can't afford to lose many of them without being defeated. And so we see this sort of slow, stable progression of government, little wiggling around like that, but it's moving forward towards improving the quality of life of citizens. Whereas when the coalition is small, it is not moving forward to improve the quality of life, except perhaps by chance. So leaders have discretionary money. We can divide leaders into three flavors with regard to discretionary money. There are thieves, that's why secret bank accounts exist. They have a way to, they steal money and they sock it away for a rainy day. There are civic-minded leaders. So we might, for example, think about two Chinese leaders, Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping, both civic-minded, neither one huge thieves. They were living well, but they were not billionaires. They both wanted to improve, as best as I can tell, sincerely wanted to improve the well-being of the average Chinese person. Mao had really dumb ideas about how to do that. Deng Xiaoping had really good ideas about how to do that. So neither one was a thief. Both were well-intentioned. One was good at it, one was bad at it. Lee Kuan Yew, he was good at it in Singapore. Kwame Nkrumah, he was terrible at it in Ghana. J.J. Rawlings was terrible at it. Then he worked out that he was getting himself in political trouble. He switched in Ghana and became a Democrat. In autocratic governments of the sort that Xi Jinping is trying to promote now, what you get, because you have a small coalition, is not that you can't have growth, but you get huge swings, depending, change leaders, and things can go really well, and they can go really badly. People like to say, today, China is the second largest economy in the world. So I like to ask my students, what was the second largest economy in the world in 1890? It was China. China went down and came back up. Of course, you have a very big population, which they had in 1892, not as big as today. It's easy to be a big economy in the aggregate. So large coalition governments, they say, they wiggle along, progressing. And small coalition governments go through big swings, depending upon what the particular leader's ideas are. So that makes small coalition autocratic governments very dangerous, because they might have a period of upswing where things look great, and then they might have a period of downswing where things look really awful. There's a real danger that Xi Jinping is taking China into a downswing period now.
Very interesting. And we're going to pivot to questions in a moment, but one question is coming up, is that, or someone messaged it to me in the chat. Can you get Bruce to spell out how bad behavior is good politics? Because there's, there's a little bit provocative aspect of that title, obviously, but yeah, I'm curious if you can lean into that.
Yeah, sure. Of course, that is the subtitle, and it's a subtitle for an important reason. If you depend on few people to keep you in power, producing a corrupt political system is the way to survive politically. If the objective is to stay in power, if good politics is doing what keeps you in power, bad policy, allowing people to steal, allowing corruption, allowing distortion of the economy to help a very small group of people, the essentials whose support you have to have, letting those people get really fat and happy is the way to survive politically. But that's bad policy. It's bad for everybody else. It's not coincidence that the large coalition regimes are, with very few exceptions, highly prosperous places with healthy, well-educated citizens. And the small coalition regimes, the leaders do great and the people do miserably. Bad politics, a bad policy is good politics for autocrats. That's how you stay in power.
And the last question I'll sneak in here before we go to the Q&A is, you mentioned there's recent research that supports the Selectorate theory. So I'm curious, maybe like a high-level overview on the research that supports it. And the other thing I'm interested in is the best criticism you received on this theory, because I imagine it could be challenged, like the initial starting premise could be challenged, but I'm curious any that are quite salient for you, the critics of the theory.
So most of the criticism of the is not of the theory, but of the way we measured things. And so we have improved the measurement. We've been responsive to the critique, some of which weren't very smart, some of which were smart. We now have a really much better measure of coalition size, and we get much better empirical results with it, although we got good results to begin with. Early on, people objected to the idea that politicians were more interested in their political survival than in the national interest or the good of the people or that sort of thing, especially in the case of democratic leaders. I had a student, a graduate student, must be close to 20 years ago, who thought the assumption that democratic leaders wanted to stay in power was crazy. That they were out to, promote policies and so forth, and that was what they were interested in. So he did was a master's thesis in which he collected data on every Democratic leader since about 1800, several hundred of them. And he investigated the conditions under which they left office. He was looking for people who had voluntarily stepped aside. I think he had 470, maybe it was 500 leaders in his data set. It's a long time ago. I don't remember the exact details. Anyway, he found, for example, some of them left office because their party was not willing to nominate them again. They didn't have support. It wasn't a choice. They were forced out. Some declared that they were leaving office because of health concerns. And he thought, well, that's just cheap talk. It turned out that leaders who said they were leaving office because of health concerns died much sooner after leaving office than leaders who didn't say that. In fact, they were sick. It was true. He went through all the various and sundry reasons that party wouldn't nominate, so on. And out of the somewhere between 470 and 500 leaders, he came down to 4 that seemed to have left power voluntarily. One of them became the head of the European Parliament. So he wondered, well, maybe this was a better job. The person had been leading a small country. So maybe that person had actually moved up in the political world. It was hard to say. One became CEO of a very large corporation. So maybe that was a step up. So that left 2 he couldn't explain. So 2 out of several hundred apparently were not interested in staying in power as long as they could. Another graduate student, this one not my student, at Trinity in Dublin, studied the efforts by autocrats who governed in places that had a constitution that imposed a term limit. He studied whether they stepped down voluntarily, and the answer was again no. All of them tried to change the constitution. Most of them succeeded. There were a few who failed, but they all tried. And by the way, in case any of you are thinking, well, but in the United States, George Washington established this tradition of 2 terms, and everybody lived by that. That's not true either. Every president who was alive at the end of a second term after Andrew Jackson, and I'll come back to the ones before that, every president who was alive at the end of a second term after Andrew Jackson sought a 3rd term. It's just the party didn't nominate them. Even Woodrow Wilson, near death, tried to get the party's nomination. If we look at the presidents from Andrew Jackson back towards Washington, so we're talking Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and Jackson were alive at the end of the second term. Jackson was over 70. The others were over 65 at a time when life expectancy was much, much lower. These were people who were seen as ancient, and in each case, they designated their successor. So they got the person in place that they wanted would carry on their views. So it turns out that this is just a myth. When you actually just research the people who had the opportunity, they all sought to stay in power. So the critiques are of that sort. There's a general, you're putting me in an awkward position here to be immodest. Okay. There is now pretty much a broad consensus in the political economy community that this is a powerful theory, that this theory is strong evidence of the great importance of institutional constraints on behavior beyond the psychology of the individual. The evidence for the theory is pretty overwhelming. It's been applied to, at this point, more than 100 dependent variables that seemingly would have nothing to do with each other than the mathematics behind this theory. We have a new set of results. They're secondary to the big results. but they're completely new, implied by the theory, which is that the mix of public and private goods and overall welfare of the coalition shifts over time the longer a leader is in office. It starts over when a new guy comes in, but the longer somebody is in office, the fewer public goods they provide, the less benefits they provide in general to the coalition, and the higher the proportion, not necessarily the absolute amount, but the proportion of private goods, of corruption opportunities to public goods. And that turns out as well to be true. It also turns out that the theory indicates that the probability of coup or revolution is strictly decreasing in how long a leader is in office. So being a petty dictator and having managed to run a really corrupt society, which means having a lot of bad policy, the longer you're in office, the more likely you are to remain in office, except for mortality. If you've made it 20 years, the probability that you're going to make it to 21 years if you don't die from disease is really, really high. Whereas if you are in the first couple of years, it's very hard to survive to the next year. That has other implications about why journalists routinely look at leaders of dictatorships who are new, who just came to power, say, oh, this person seems to be a reformer. Aung San Suu Kyi in Myanmar, oh, a democratic reformer. We see this all the time. When Raul took over from Fidel, going to be reform. Well, it turns out the probability of being ousted from power in the first couple of years in office is higher for autocrats, small coalition leaders, than it is for Democrats. So in the first couple of years, while you're figuring out where the money is and how to be corrupt, it's efficient to pretend to be a reformer because Democrats survive more easily in the first 2 years. After the first couple of years, once you've figured out who's loyal to you, who's not, who should be getting the bribes, who shouldn't, then Democratic survival is much worse than autocratic survival. Small coalition leaders are much more likely, if they've made it to the third year, to make it to the fourth year than are Democratic leaders. And so they show their true stripes. So my co-author, Alastair, and I routinely write pieces when claims are made, oh, this one's a reformer. You don't know that for the next 2 years. Hold on. They're going to act like a reformer. It's in their interest to act like a reformer if they want to survive. So we don't know whether they intend reform or not. We were told that Mohammed bin Salman was a reformer. You might recall, he's let women drive. It doesn't seem so reformist now.
Reformist mimicry has a survival advantage. Very cool. So some of the questions are populating the chat, and I'm not going to pick you in any particular order, and just have one follow-up question. And so we'll start with Lynn. Lynn, you had a question.
Thank you, Peter. And Bruce, it is a powerful theory and a grim one. My question is around, if you have coalitions that are popular and there's a lot of people who want to have something happen, since this seems like a theory of leaders and rivals dispensing benefits and so forth, what levers in this model would a large coalition have to kind of move forward its agenda?
So this is a great question. When the coalition is very large, so first of all, we should recognize when the coalition is very large, we're talking about an electoral system. There are no very large coalition systems that are not electoral. So the people, depending upon the rules of the election, I'll talk about that in a minute, the people have chosen the policy package that they want. Elections in large coalition political systems, competition in large coalition political systems are arms races over ideas about public policy. So the person who seems, the candidates or the party that seems to have the better policy ideas is the one that wins. And people, unfortunately, are also fickle. So if they change their mind about what's good policy, you might win on a set of policies and get kicked out for the same policies a few years later. Competition in smaller coalition regimes is not over policy ideas, because policy ideas, public goods, reward everybody. And the key is to keep the coalition loyal, because there's always somebody trying to take your job. And it's more efficient to give extra benefits to the coalition when it's, if you need to keep 100 people loyal, it's not that hard to bribe them. If you have to keep 1 million people loyal, you can't bribe them with, it's just too expensive. So you have to be switching over to policy. So the competition is over policy as the coalition gets bigger. What constitutes good policy? Well, there's no objective answer to that. It is what we, the people, would like. And when we change our mind, that which was good is no longer good. I should add, there is not a best way to elect leaders. There's a very important theorem by the late Kenneth Arrow, who won the Nobel Prize for this. He set out a small set, depending on how you divide things up, 4 or 5 normative conditions that would make elections fair in terms of taking people's preferences and having the outcome reflect what the choosers wanted. And what he proved was that these 4 or 5 conditions contradict each other, and therefore it is impossible, we call it the impossibility theorem, it is impossible to design a way of adding up people's votes that guarantees a correspondence between what people want and what people get. I'll illustrate this very briefly because I know there are a lot of questions out there. With the 1992 presidential election, so we had Bill Clinton, George Herbert Walker Bush, and Ross Perot competing for the presidency. Clinton got 43% of the popular vote, Bush got 38%, and Perot got 19%. Put aside for the moment the Electoral College, which makes things complicated. If we use a first past the post, British Westminster style system, whoever got more votes than anybody else wins, Clinton would be president, and he was president. He got 43%. If we used the French runoff system, so you have everybody run against each other, and then if nobody gets a majority, the 2 top vote getters go head to head, and the people who voted for the third party candidate, of course, get to vote. They get to vote for their second choice. George Herbert Walker Bush would have been elected in 1992. And if we used what's called now ranked voting, such as board account, there's a lot of different ways of doing ranked voting, but ranked voting has become very popular. So your first choice candidate in a board account would get, with 3 candidates, gets 2 points. Your second choice gets 1, your third choice gets 0. So we know that the Clinton voters preferred Perot to Bush, and the Bush voters preferred Perot to Clinton. If we had used the ranked voting system, Ross Perot would have been president. Nobody's vote would have, nobody's preference would have changed. Nobody would have cheated in counting votes. Just how we added them up would have decided who was president. There are lots of ways to add up votes, and they can produce radically different results without any cheating.
Good, Lynn. Okay, thank you. Stephanie, you had a question.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Bruce. I'll keep this pretty simple. I mean, I'll make this kind of two questions. One is just what to do. Like, where does this all lead you in terms, where do you find hope or inspiration for the capacity of whether you consider it democracy or something else? And then how does the evolution of human consciousness factor into your theory? Do you believe that our consciousness is evolving at all, or do you think we're simply evolving in the tactics that we use to maintain our own power?
Well, certainly we are evolving. And after all, these institutions like the Winning Coalition and the Selectorate don't emerge spontaneously. They are chosen. People design them. And the question is whether we allow a small set of leaders to design them, they'll design them to advance their interests, or whether we insist on a lot of us participating in designing them, in which case they'll serve our interests. So yeah, of course, we evolved, we have interests. All of these things, to use the jargon of political economy, the institutions are endogenous. They are strategic choices of people. We don't wake up and there they are. What can be done? Well, my colleague Alastair Smith and I are writing a book at the moment, extending the selector theory and looking at instability, by which we mean change in leader, change in policies, and/or change in institutions. And there are lots of things that people can do to change these things. One of the mistakes that a lot of researchers make is they spend a lot of time trying to study and predict things like revolutions or coups, whereas our claim is that if we could predict when revolutions will happen, so could leaders. And leaders have a very strong interest in predicting revolutions, because revolutions are very, 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 very bad for the life expectancy of the leader. So what we should be studying is not predicting revolutions, but measuring when leaders believe they face a rising threat of revolution or a rising threat of coup, because then they can fix the problem. There are several ways they can fix it, some depressing, some not. They can engage in horrible things like torture and extra-legal killing. Sadly, that greatly improves their political survival. Or they can adjust policies or institutions to buy off the threat. So when there's a threat of revolution, their first resort is to try to torture the leaders and kill the leaders of the revolutionary threat that they perceive. Nothing has actually happened. Nobody is taken to the streets. This is all, they're imagining it. But their secondary response is, well, if you think the people are going to rise up, the way to buy them off is to liberalize the government. If you think the coalition is going to rise up against you in a coup, the way to buy them off is to purge some of them and increase private goods. So there are good solutions from the perspective of the people in general, and there are bad solutions. But those things can be motivated. And I occasionally get asked about these things by governments, and I make the point that in terms of foreign intervention, sort of quiet intervention, I don't mean military intervention, the opportunity to steer a government towards a better direction, a more democratic direction, is when the incumbent has died and there's a new leader. Because as I said, the new leader has an interest in feigning to be a reformer. You can then adopt policies that will lock that person into being a more democratic reformer. Unfortunately, against that, this is terrible, depressing, but it is the logic of the theory. Democratic leaders are not interested as a foreign policy matter, except under very special circumstances, in promoting democracy elsewhere. If you think about why we give so much foreign aid, for example, to petty dictators, you can buy policy concessions from a petty dictator, meaning they're adopting a policy you want that their people don't want. They can do that because they survive in power, not by making the people happy, but by making their small coalition happy. Now they're going to get free money, foreign aid, with which to bribe their cronies some more. And so the cronies will be happy to sell out on policy in order to get the money. If you try to bribe a democratic leader, well, that leader's going to turn and say, well, but if I adopt this policy that my citizens don't like, they're going to vote me out of office. So I can't do that unless you give me enough money that I can compensate them. So democratic countries get very little foreign aid. That is very unlikely to get foreign aid. But if they get foreign aid, they get a lot more per capita than autocratic countries, because you have to compensate. So the democratic leader, it's cheaper to buy autocrats than to buy democrats. So we don't want to promote democracy, though we could through these transitions. It's all very depressing.
Any
It
follow-up
is,
questions?
however, how the world works, as far as I can tell.
Any follow-up questions, Stephanie?
I do, but I also know there are so many other questions. So yeah, let's just pass it on.
All right. Tyler, you had a question.
Yeah. Hey, thanks. Well, I want to express a lot of appreciation, Bruce. I think this is really fascinating. I'm glad you're here talking with us. I have a question that it might be a little bit of a tangent, and I don't have any particular expectations of how you're going to answer this, but I'm very curious if you have any opinions about the ideas of these increasingly popular sort of utopian ideologies, such as anarchism or libertarianism or other of those sort of flavors of things that, from their perspective, they would say that they're advocating for systems that would actually increase democracy in the sense of increasing the power of the people. But they basically, in various different ways, they generally advocate for just kind of totally abandoning representative democracy to have like, small local government, or like put all the power in the hands of individuals and markets and things of this nature. I wonder, if you have any thoughts about how that, that type of sort of utopian ideology might play out in real world political maneuvering.
So let me separate my opinion from the logic of this theory, because my opinion is not worth any more than anybody else's, but the theory I think is, so I'll stick with the theory. So libertarians and anarchists have really quite different ideas about how to run the world. So let me talk about libertarians or libertarianism in this context. So I am reminded of a conversation I had when I was at Stanford with a very good friend whose cousin was running for Congress in Wyoming and had lots of deeply held policy preferences. And I said to her, well, he was a Democrat, so therefore he was unlikely to get elected in Wyoming, and he didn't get elected. But if he gets elected, the fact that he wants to do X, Y, and Z is irrelevant. So we could put that aside. Why is it irrelevant? Because if this theory is right, so I'm a libertarian, I want to make the individual as well off as possible. I don't want regulation. I don't want a state interfering and so forth. Great. I now come to power. And I come to power in an electoral system. And I would like to get rid of the electoral system. But the only way I can be in power is through the electoral system or by overthrowing it. I don't have the clout to overthrow it. I have a winning coalition of a certain size. If I do the things that my coalition likes, they'll reelect me. If I do the things contrary to what my coalition likes, they'll throw me out, throw the rascals out. So I might want to do things quite different from what my constituents want. And I could do that for the short time that I've been elected, but I won't get reelected. So now I have to decide, and then the next person will undo those things because that's what they got elected to do. So I'm sort of trapped in if I can't change the institutions, I'm trapped to have to do what the institutions incentivize me to do if I want to stay in power. So if it's a very small coalition, I need to engage in corruption, even if I'm a libertarian and I view that as a terrible thing. I believe that the only regulation of the market should be to protect people's property. So I'm certainly not in favor of giving contracts to the people who are politically loyal to me and not giving contracts to people who are better at doing things. But if I've got a small coalition and I want to stay in power, that's what I have to do, or I'll be removed. If I have a big coalition, I've got voters. And if I don't do what they want, they're going to get somebody who will do what they want. I mean, this is exactly the explanation every journalist gives us now for why so many Republicans adhere to a Trump approach, even though allegedly in private, they say that they detest Trump. because while their general electorate might prefer a non-Trump point of view, they have to go through a primary. And primary voters are disproportionately more activist voters, and in the Republican side of the ledger, more Trump-oriented. And so you can't run for office if you don't get through the primary. You got to get through the primary. Then you could try to switch your stripes. That can be a little difficult. So they're stuck. Indeed, I believe it's 47 states have what are called sore loser laws. If you run in a primary and you lose, you cannot then run as an independent or third-party candidate for the office you were defeated for. So the sore loser law setup is you're going to depend on a very small coalition, the ones that turn out in the primary, to dictate what you can be in favor of. And voila, it might be that you don't believe a word you're saying, but it's the path to winning. So we cannot, the only time we can tell the difference between a politician who means what he or she is saying and doesn't is when they say things that they know are against their interests. When Winston Churchill in his El Alamein speech said, "I did not become the king's first minister to preside over the dissolution of the British Empire," he knew that was going to cost him a lot of votes. He meant it. Strom Thurmond, senator from South Carolina till he was over 100 years old, an avid racist most of his life, but then after the 1965 Voting Rights Act was passed and he had a large Black constituency in South Carolina, he began to support some civil rights legislation. Which was the real Strom Thurmond? Almost certainly it was the racist, but we don't know. What we know is that when being a racist got you elected, he was a racist. And when being less racist got you elected, he was less racist. So I think that is the answer to what libertarians or anarchists or whatever will do. If they want to stay in power, they will do what it takes to stay in power.
Yeah, got to follow the rules. Right. Thank you.
Got to
That
follow
makes
the
sense.
rules.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Tyler. Let's see there's a couple good questions here. Madalena, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, thank you so much for this work. I don't think this is a tangent, but I'm just really, really curious how the authors, well, you in this case, see Taiwan's digital democracy and Audrey Tang's hacker.gov harvesting of improbable consensus towards having government be obligant to civic iterative propositions, reaching a critical threshold of consensus, and exercising quadratic voting, as well as providing sandbox spaces where experimental self-governments and reformulating of legislation is made possible if a critical consensus is obtained around specific community-generated propositions. Why vote every 4 years when we can digitally vote every time a proposition attracts consensus beyond partisan politics? And I would add that Consilience Project did a paper on Audrey Tang's work and Taiwan's digital government, which I'll post if anybody wants to be more familiar with it. Thank you.
Hard question, interesting question. Let me see how I can do. So there are places, Switzerland is very much of a referendum consensus voting society. I lived in California for 24 years. California is very big on consensus proposition voting, though when I left California, it was not yet super well digitized. So here's the downside of the opportunity for continuous voting. And this downside has been exacerbated over the past, or emphasized over the past 4 years. I'm going to relate specifically to California because I know the literature on California voting. So once you have a system where policy is going to be not representative government, but democratic, everybody can vote and can vote quickly, frequently. So you immediately run into the problem, which California has run into, of lots of referenda, and you cannot tell which one, what they actually imply, what they actually do. When I was, shortly before I left Palo Alto, there was a referendum on raising chickens in a humane way. More free range, more space in the cages, and so on and so forth. And this seemed to me to be a desirable thing. And my wife and I voted for it. And we, unfortunately, after rather than before we voted, spoke to a good friend who was quite involved and knowledgeable about these matters. And she got very upset that we had voted for it. It was a terrible thing to vote for. I was mystified as to why this would have been a terrible thing to vote for. I'd like to think I'm a reasonably intelligent, well-informed voter. Well, it turned out this was really being backed by the Idaho chicken farms that were not raising the chickens in a humane way. They were trying to get the price up sufficiently in parts of California that they would sell more chickens, which is, as it turns out, what happened in California. So this rapid voting doesn't leave a lot of time for being really well informed and understanding the subtle implications. One of the series of studies by political scientists on what was the best piece of information to have in California about a referendum in terms of whether you supported it or not. It was not the wording of the referendum, which was always very convoluted, so you weren't quite sure if yes was yes or yes was no, and so on. It was the list of who sponsored it, because they had actual, you could look them up and research them and find. So then, of course, they quickly solved this problem. They created shell companies that had shell companies that had shells. So you were looking at it supported by something that existed for 10 minutes, and you now had to invest a lot of time to work your way back. So from that perspective, representative government is superior to direct democracy, and infrequent voting is superior to constant digital voting because it provides the opportunity, which a lot of people unfortunately don't take, but it provides a better opportunity to be genuinely informed about the things that you are voting on instead of rolling the dice. Because of course, again, I use the word endogenous. Once you're in a digitized voting environment where you can vote all the time, the people trying to manipulate outcomes, the people with a strong interest in the outcome, will construct the process strategically to make it harder for you to tell the difference between it's going to be humane raising of chickens, or those chickens aren't going to exist, and it's going to be the Idaho chickens.
No, I hear that. Although I can't help feeling like this is so young as a paradigm shift that it really merits people like you who have studied, across time to see how we who are the new online ancestors, because really all of us are right here, this conversation wouldn't be possible without this paradigm shift, to really not be cynical about the possibilities that we have yet to explore, since Taiwan is 26 million people, I think. So that's a significant and under massive disinformation campaign pressure from China. So it's not as if they're not exposed to massive disinformation.
No. Well, let me be very clear. I have advised the Taiwanese government in the past, and I'm a very strong personal supporter of the survival of Taiwan. That doesn't make it true that digital voting is the right path. Should the experiment be run? Why not? But I will give you an immediate example that you've all had that tells you how in a very short time digital voting will be manipulated to a point where we have no idea what's going on. If you went to a bakery this morning and you bought a croissant, or you bought a bagel, or whatever it is that you bought, or you went to some other shop and bought something, you almost certainly got a survey. Were you happy with the service, a smiley face or a sad face? And you clicked on the smiley face, and then you got a survey, and the survey was designed to get positive answers. It was not designed for the bakery or whatever to learn about how they could do better. It was designed for them to be able to tell customers, oh, you know, out of 42,000 responses, 99% were fives. You flew on a plane and then you got a survey, and if you said something negative, you didn't get the next question. And if you said something positive, it was, again, designed to produce a positive answer. My wife and I tried to get our kids and grandkids all together twice a year in one place, rent a big house. There are 14 of us as a group. A few years ago, we rented a house through a perfectly legitimate organization. We've done this a lot, been very successful. This one time, my wife didn't notice that the homeowner, in addition to the company, had their own terms that you were signing off on. She signed the contract. The house was a disaster. She wrote a negative review, and she got a letter telling us that we were going to be sued if we didn't withdraw the negative review. And it turned out in the homeowner's contract, there was a codicil that said you cannot write a negative review. Well, what's the point of reviews if you can't? You know, it didn't occur to either my wife or me and so we wrote to the company. It was Verbo that was doing this, and they said, well, there's nothing we can do because you signed this. You agreed. So this is the danger that the other side, I guess it is to be cynical, the other side, there's always another side to any issue. The other side always figures out, and you figured out, how to manipulate the structure to work better for what they want. And then it's an arms race in the ideas of manipulating the structure rather than what the actual ideas are.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for the question.
Sorry to be so depressing, you know.
No. That's you know, we're well equipped to handle this at the Stoa. Yes, we reached the top of the hour, and perhaps we can gently close here. Bruce, any parting words you'd like to leave us with today at the Stoa?
I really appreciate your listening. I hope you will read the book, and some of you will dabble into the actual mathematics. It's not in this book, but in the journal articles and so forth. And I just would urge people always to think about the way to improve governance outcomes is simple. It is to make the leaders depend on more people. The more people they have to answer to, the better the answers they will provide. And you can do science about studying politics. That would be my other message.
Very cool. I'm going to make some closing announcements in a moment, but Bruce, thank you so much for coming to the Stoa today. That was an awesome session. Do check out his book, the new edition of the Dictator's Handbook. And our next session of the Stoa is this Friday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Rebecca Fox is returning in a session called Describing Ritual. And so she's going to discuss her theory on ritual and how to create bespoke rituals. So super excited about that. And you can RSVP at thestoa.ca. So that being said, everyone, thanks so much for coming to the Stoa today.